Once upon a time in America, in a small log cabin surrounded by wild animals and dirt floors, was born a baby boy. His name was Abraham Lincoln. His log cabin did not have electricity or running water. In fact, it didn't even have a door. The family had to crawl through a hole in the wall to get inside. But even though they were poor, young Abraham would look up at the stars in the night sky and dream big dreams. He dreamed of a better life, a life where he could be anything he wanted to be. And even though he grew up without a father and with little education, he became one of the most important presidents in American history. So today, we will talk about the amazing story of Abraham Lincoln, the man who lived in a log cabin and became President of the United States. In 1809, Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin in Kentucky, USA. His mother died when he was only 9 years old, so his father had to leave and find another woman to marry. Young Abraham then went to live with his sister and her husband, and he helped them out on their farm by chopping wood, making fences, and cleaning their house. Even though Abraham had to work long hours every day, he loved to read books by borrowing them from his friends. He would sit for hours reading books about law and government and history. And as he grew older, he began to think about becoming a lawyer. When Abraham was 23, he started working as a postmaster so that he could earn some money. And for the next few years, he saved all his money so that he could buy books and study law. Finally, after 3 years, he was able to start his own law practice. But unfortunately, not many people came to him for help, so he had to take on other jobs to make ends meet. For example, he once worked as a storekeeper, but he was not very good at it because he was too honest. One time a customer asked him to break a $10 bill for him. Even though the man gave Abraham a $20 bill, Abraham only gave him back $10.37 because that was all the money he owed him. Another time, Abraham was helping out at his friend's tavern, and one night a group of men came in and stole some beer. Abraham chased them outside, but when he got there, he saw that they had already run away. And even though the tavern owner was angry, Abraham said that there was nothing they could do about it. "The dead past is past," he said. "It is not ours to mourn or fret over. It is rather ours to learn from it." These examples show us that even though Abraham was poor and didn't have much education, he was still a hard worker, and he always tried to do what was right, even if it meant losing money or getting into trouble. And over time, his honesty and intelligence made him famous in his community. So when the time came for him to run for public office, people trusted him and voted him into the Illinois House of Representatives. But Abraham wasn't done with school yet. After serving in the Illinois House of Representatives for 4 years, he decided to run for the U.S. Senate, but when it was time for the vote, he lost by less than 1%. Although he was disappointed, he didn't give up. He kept working hard and eventually won a seat in the U.S. Senate. In the meantime, Abraham met a man named Stephen Douglas, who was running for president. And even though they were from different parties, they became good friends. They traveled together all over the country, giving speeches and meeting new people. And Abraham learned a lot from Stephen about how to be a good leader. However, after Abraham became a senator, he started to disagree with Stephen about slavery. At that time, slavery was a very controversial topic in America. Some people thought it was wrong to keep other people as slaves, while others thought it was necessary for the economy. And even though Abraham had never been a slave owner himself, he believed that all people are created equal and should be treated with respect. So when the time came for him to vote on whether to allow slavery in new territories, he voted against it. And this decision made him very unpopular in the South. Many people thought he was a radical abolitionist, someone who wanted to end slavery throughout the entire country. And even though he was only trying to prevent slavery from spreading to new areas, his opponents used this issue to attack him and make him seem like a threat to the way of life in the South. One time, Abraham was giving a speech in a town in Illinois, and a group of pro-slavery men started yelling at him and throwing things at him. But even though they were trying to scare him away, he kept talking about how important it was to preserve the Union. That's when one of the men threw a Chad's word at him. But even though it hit him right next to his heart, he didn't even flinch. Instead, he picked up the sword and held it up in the air. "If any one of you gentlemen wants to take this off my hands," he said, "I am ready for you." Then he continued his speech until the crowd left. Another time, Abraham was traveling by train from Illinois to Washington, D.C. to take his oath as senator. When he arrived at the station in Springfield, a group of pro-slavery men were waiting for him. They surrounded the train and started yelling at him and banging on the windows. And even though Abraham was scared, he didn't run away or hide. He stayed in his seat and looked the men in the eye until they finally left. And these stories show us that even though Abraham was sometimes afraid, he never gave up. He always stood up for what he believed in, no matter how dangerous it was. And this bravery made him even more respected by the people who knew him. Then in 1860, something amazing happened. The Republican Party nominated him to be their candidate for President of the United States. Even though he was running against some very famous politicians at the time, Abraham won the election and became the 16th President of the United States. However, his presidency was not easy. In fact, it was one of the most difficult times in American history. When Abraham became president, 7 southern states left the Union and started their own country called the Confederacy. And soon after that, the Confederate Army attacked a fort in South Carolina. And this started the Civil War, a war that would decide whether the United States would stay together or break apart. At first, the war was not going well for the Union. In fact, the Confederacy was winning most of the battles, so many people thought Abraham was not strong enough to lead the country through this crisis. But even though he was facing all this criticism, he never gave up. He kept fighting for the Union, and eventually the Union Army started to win more battles. And this is when Abraham gave his famous speech at Gettysburg. For 67 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, to take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, to give our lives that nation might live. And in a larger sense, to ourselves and our posterity, we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth. This speech made Abraham even more famous. People all over the country started to see him as a true leader, someone who was willing to sacrifice anything to save the Union. And even though the war lasted for 4 more years, the Union Army eventually won. And when the war was over, Abraham was re-elected as president. During his second term in office, he worked hard to help the country heal from the war. And even though he could have been bitter towards the people who had tried to destroy the Union, he forgave them and offered them a chance to start over. And this showed the world that he was not only a great leader, but also a very compassionate person. However, just 4 months after his second inauguration, Abraham was assassinated by a man named John Wilkes Booth, even though he was only president for 4 years. He changed America forever, proved that even a poor boy from a log cabin could become president of the United States, if he worked hard and never gave up. And he also showed us that true greatness comes from being honest, humble, and brave. So whenever you feel like giving up on your dreams, just remember the story of Abraham Lincoln, the man who lived in a log cabin and became president of the United States. Thank you for watching this video about the incredible life of Abraham Lincoln. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more inspirational content. And if you want to know more about amazing people from history, click on the video that appears on screen now.